welcome. Antitrust law is having a moment. The growth of the digital economy and resulting changes to how we live and work has led some to question whether current competition rules are still fit for purpose. The European Union recently passed the Digital Markets Act, which is designed specifically to target a handful of US tech companies. The governments of Australia and Canada are in the midst of reviewing their respective competition policies. And here in the US, the last Congress saw a frantic push to pass a set of bills that would turn decades of antitrust practice on its head. And the enforcement agencies have claimed authorities that by historical standards are unusually aggressive and go well beyond what a plain text reading of existing statutes would seem to allow. Conducting periodic reviews of the efficacy of existing laws is an exercise in both prudence and responsible governance. And no one denies that the digital economy has created novel challenges. But they're mostly related to data privacy. The fact that living much of our lives online requires turning over large amounts of personal data with no sense of how and for what purposes that information is subsequently used. No matter how legitimate, antitrust law is clearly not the right vehicle to ameliorate those types of concerns. And it underscores the need for both legislators and regulators to ponder carefully what specific outcomes they're seeking and how best to achieve them. This brings me to my guest. I'm excited to speak with Sruthi Thatchenkery, who is an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University's Owen Graduate School of Management. Prior to joining Vanderbilt, she was on the faculty of University College London for 6 years. Professor Thatchenkery teaches MBA courses on innovation and technology strategy, and her research sits at the intersection of networks, competition, and innovation. She earned her BS in economics summa cum laude from Duke University, and she received her PhD from Stanford. Professor, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Mort.
You recently published an article about your research on antitrust actions against large online platforms in the Harvard Business Review. What were your top-line conclusions?
So that Harvard Business Review article was basically summarizing a study carried out by me and my co-author Rita Katila back at Stanford, where we looked at how third-party application developers responded to the landmark US v. Microsoft settlement back in 2001. Now, you might be thinking that case is over 20 years old. Isn't this a little bit late? But if you look at what Microsoft was accused of doing in terms of alleged anti-competitive conduct, it's very similar to the themes that we're seeing in the antitrust discussion around big tech today, especially when you look at things like integrating the platform with third-party or complementary applications and self-preferencing behavior. And so when we looked at the Microsoft case, what we did econometrically is we basically distinguished between software markets in which Microsoft was a kind of complementary competitor, so they actually had applications in those markets, versus markets in which Microsoft wasn't really much of a factor. And so since the antitrust settlement was really aimed at reducing Microsoft's ability to leverage its power as a platform in these complementary markets, we would expect to see a reaction from the firms that were already competing against Microsoft and not much of a reaction from the firms that were not. And that's pretty much exactly what we saw. But what was interesting is that it was actually a bit of a mixed bag for these third-party software developers. We did see evidence that innovation increased. So there was a very sharp increase in patenting and R&D investment in the markets that would be more sensitive to the settlement. But on the flip side, their profitability went down, which is maybe not so great if you think that usually firms try to innovate in pursuit of eventually making money. And another interesting kind of twist to this is that the innovation increases were really driven by small firms in those markets, and the profitability penalties were also kind of disproportionately suffered by those firms. So from a regulatory point of view, maybe that's fine. But for the software developers themselves, it seems they certainly tried to pursue opportunities that may have been opened up by having some constraints put on Microsoft via the antitrust intervention, but they weren't actually able to benefit from that financially.
Interesting. In the EU, leading members of the European Parliament have implied that without strong support from certain unnamed US companies, they might not have been able to pass the Digital Markets. Does your research allow you to draw any conclusions about who would be most likely to benefit from regulatory and or legislative interventions in digital markets?
So that is why I went ahead and mentioned that we saw the kind of innovation increase and profit penalty concentrated among the smaller firms in the software markets around, the turn of the millennium in the early 2000s. So these small firms were the ones that I think saw the most opportunity from Microsoft kind of now having some shackles put on what it could and couldn't do in these complementary markets. And so they really did try to innovate and pursue those opportunities. But what we see is that their R&D spending goes up and their sales just stayed flat. So they were not able to convert that effort, that innovation effort, into profitable sales. On the other hand, the big firms in those markets didn't actually increase their innovation spending that much. And they also didn't suffer a profit penalty. So they, in a way, were the ones who actually benefited more from the intervention. It was kind of the big firms that were perhaps in second and third place, rather than the smaller actors that I think from a regulatory perspective, you might hope would be most aided by an antitrust intervention. I'll also mention that while it wasn't part of our main analysis, we did also look for evidence of entrepreneurial entry in some markets that would have been more sensitive to the intervention. And again, we found that there actually wasn't evidence of increased startup activity after the settlement either. So when you put that together, the lack of startup activity, along with the fact that the smallest firms who were doing the innovating were not able to profit or benefit financially, that does suggest that the big winners from the Microsoft settlement were probably the firms that were just below Microsoft. So, not as powerful, they didn't have a Windows of their own, but they were perhaps, leaders in these application markets. I won't say which firms, right? But if you know kind of especially the enterprise software industry of the late 90s and early 2000s, you probably know who I might be thinking of. They were the ones who kind of benefited more from the intervention. Now, to what extent will that generalize to today? Again, I think the interventions themselves that are being proposed are pretty similar to the Microsoft intervention. And in particular, what's interesting is to see with the DMA and then also some of the proposed legislation in the US, they're setting conduct rules kind of based on size. So if you are over a certain threshold in users or business users sometimes or market cap, then these rules apply to you. And if you're not over that threshold, perhaps they don't. And so that would kind of suggest that maybe the optimal strategy is to just stay right under that threshold, and then you get to do whatever you want. But even if, you have less than, $1 billion or $1 trillion in market cap, you probably are still a pretty powerful firm in your own right. And so I think, that it's not surprising perhaps to hear that some big unnamed firms might have been pushing for this legislation, because I think there are kind of a lot of number 2 or number 3 actors in these markets that perhaps stand to benefit from putting, a leash around Google and Apple and Amazon and all those kinds of folks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The current heads of the US enforcement agencies clearly disfavor behavioral remedies in antitrust conduct cases. According to Assistant Attorney General Cantor, quote, experience shows that it is often impossible to craft behavioral remedies that anticipate the complex incentives that drive corporate decision-making, unquote. As a result, he has vowed to pursue, quote, structural remedies whenever possible, unquote. What does your research say about how likely structural remedies are to work in platform markets?
So there's a lot of research in strategy and economics on platform, or what you might also call multi-sided markets. So the idea is that they connect users with perhaps third-party application developers or sellers or advertisers, basically bringing together multiple actors in a central intermediary platform. And one thing we know from this research that is very well established at this point is that there are actually returns to scale for the users. So users actually get more value out of bigger platforms. An easy way to think of this would be something like a social network. If Facebook only had 100 users, then we don't get much value out of it because the likelihood that one of our friends is on it is pretty low. When Facebook has 1 billion users, then it probably connects us to a lot of people we know, and we actually get more value out of the platform itself. By the same token, if you think of an operating system that has lots of users will attract a lot of application developers who in turn tend to attract more users as well, because application developers like access to users and users like access to a wide variety of applications. And so these are often called network effects. I think if you've been around tech long enough, you've certainly heard that term before. But the main idea is that bigger platforms actually create more value for users. So one form of structural remedy might be to say that platforms shouldn't be allowed to reach a certain size, or they should be broken up when they reach a certain size. And just what we know about the way that platform markets function, that doesn't really make sense. We don't want to artificially keep platforms small in the name of protecting consumers, when in fact, consumers often get more value out of bigger platforms. Now, another way you might impose a structural remedy in a platform market would be to say, hey, maybe it's fine that the platform can be really big, but it shouldn't be allowed to compete in these complementary markets. So for example, an operating system owner should not be allowed to sell applications or apps for their own platform. Now, I would say that the research on this is not as entirely conclusive. It's still a bit in progress, right? There are lots of really great scholars in the platforms world working on this, but it does generally show that there isn't necessarily harm to the platform owner simply competing in a complementary market. So the fact, for example, that Google, in addition to a search engine, also gives you results related to Google Maps, to Google reviews, that's not necessarily an issue. In fact, there's a lot of benefit often from having what we call first-party complements, where the platform owner also develops complementary applications or services. The problem is if they're the only option, right? So you still want to preserve competition in the complementary markets. Now, we do know from research on platform strategy that from the platform owner's perspective, they actually want third-party complements. So most platform owners do not want to completely preclude competition among complements on their platform. They know that no one firm, no matter how big, is able to provide kind of the variety of complements that consumers usually want. And so it's actually really important to have a healthy ecosystem that involves a large variety of third-party complements. And so if you were a platform owner that was perhaps ruling with too hard of an iron fist when it comes to managing those third parties, what we'd usually see is that they would be outcompeted by another platform owner that gives kind of more freedom or is more welcoming to a variety of third parties. We saw this in the video game industry when Nintendo kind of lost its throne to Sega and then finally Sony because it was a little bit too harsh with those third-party video game developers. And I imagine that if a platform owner today was too draconian with how it managed complements, we would start to see competition and those complements moving perhaps to an alternative platform.
Very interesting. SIA's position, so our position is that our antitrust laws work remarkably well, and that the need for change is limited, if it exists at all. But if Congress were to decide to change anything, are there levers that might be particularly well suited to increase consumer choice and improve competition in digital markets based on your research?
So I will say, I think the Microsoft settlement from 2001 is actually a good template in some ways. And I will say just historically, that is something that was supported by SIIA at the time. So they were on the side of Sun and Netscape and that whole little battle there. But I think there are kind of two things that are really good about the Microsoft settlement, and that could be used perhaps to help shape what might be done going forward. One is that it was very specific about the harm that was being done to consumers and particularly consumer choice. So for those who don't know about the case, Microsoft was not just bundling its own applications with its platforms like Windows, but it was making it so that you couldn't set other applications as a default and you couldn't uninstall the Microsoft applications. So there, it's pretty clear that you actually are limiting consumer choice. You're not giving them an option when it comes to these complementer apps. So if they want to use Windows, they have to use all these other Microsoft applications as well. The other thing that I think was very good about the Microsoft settlement is that it then set out remedies that were very tailored to that particular situation. So it wasn't saying things like you cannot bundle or integrate complementer applications with the platform. It was just saying the way Microsoft was doing it was not okay. And Microsoft had to change specific things about how it dealt with what were called ISV, independent software vendors at the time, OEMs like IBM, and then other third-party kind of software developers. And so I think going forward, rather than trying to create rules that would work for every platform and every situation, I think it's important to focus on what is the potential harm being done to consumer choice and what kind of remedy might address that directly. Part of what's important, I think, is that these platforms in terms of their actual businesses are very different. So a behavior that might be anti-competitive and harmful on Amazon might not be for Google or vice versa. And so you don't necessarily want one kind of narrow set of rules for everyone. But also, I think just to set kind of the rules for the platform owners themselves, you might give signals as to where the line is, when is it that the platform owner might be going too far. But the more specific you can be, and I think the more tailored to each situation, I think the better. Because if you try to create kind of a general framework that is meant to apply to every possible platform, whether they're in social media or they're an e-commerce platform or a search engine, I think you might be just restricting them a little too much because, quite frankly, I get a lot of value out of the fact that when I search for a restaurant on Google, I not only get the restaurant's website, but I also get maps, the directions, I get a summary of reviews, I get lots of information that Google has compiled. And I think a lot of people would say the same thing when you look at things like the integration of Apple products across different platforms and with the applications that Apple offers. So I think, just try to be very specific about what the potential harm to consumers would be, and tailoring remedies for a particular situation, I think, is kind of the best way to go.
Thank you so much for spending some time with me this afternoon and for sharing your insights. I think you hit on a number of really important points. I think my main takeaway, the most important, is that, if lawmakers, if regulators really want to change anything, for them to be very, very specific about the goal that they're trying to achieve. And so, again, thank you so much for joining me, and we will look forward to another Tech and conversation sometime in the future. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.